So, welcome to this morning session. With this morning session, we have just entered the second half of our summer school. Tempus fugit, time flies, alas. But on a very positive note, had we not reached this second part, we would not have the privilege and the honor to welcome and introduce Professor Pagani, who so kindly accepted to be with us today. Samuela Pagani is an associate professor of Arabic language and literature at the University of Salento, here in Italy. Formerly, she has taught Arabic language and literature, as well as Arabic literary translation at various universities in Italy and France. Her research interests revolve around three main areas. The first one is, of course, the area of Sufi studies, an area that she approaches from both a historical and philological standpoint. And she is, of course, a renowned specialist on Nâbulusî, the author she is going to talk about today. She has also an interest on Arabic Islamic literature in general, and the first area she specializes in is Arab modern and contemporary literature. The vastness of these research interests is reflected in numerous works in English, French, and Italian she has produced throughout her impressive academic career. Works that include monographical studies, articles on scientific journals, chapters in volumes, reviews, and a great many literary translations from Arabic, English, and French. It is impossible to mention all of them here, but I must mention on this occasion the great many articles and contributions on Nâbulusî she has produced. And for those who want to find out more, they can visit her personal page on the official website of the University of Salento. But I must mention here as well the critical editions she has curated of three of the most important works of Nâbulusî: غاية المطلوب في محبة المحبوب، نتيجة العلوم ونصيحة علماء الرسوم, and الحامل في الفلك والمحمول في الفلك. Yes, no, there is no need for further delay. We are all looking forward to hearing from her. So the title of her talk today is Akbarian Hagiology in Ottoman Damascus, Some Thoughts on the Role of the Perfect Man in the Work of al-Ganî and al-Nâbulusî. Please, Professor Pagani.
Many thanks, Federico. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, perfectly.
Well, first of all, I'm pleased and honored of having been invited to give a lecture at this very instructive summer school, even though I regret not having been able to follow all of the previous presentations. So, what it means to be human, what is human perfection, is a pervasive theme also in the works of al-Ganî and al-Nâbulusî, both in its theoretical and practical dimensions. In this talk, I will mainly focus on the latter, and for this reason, I think it proper to dwell at some length on the historical background of Nâbulusî's work. After speaking of this background, I will move to the analysis of some textual examples, focusing mainly on his commentary on Ibn Arabi's chapter on Yunus, Jonah, in the Fusus. Since the 80s, Nâbulusî has been the object of a number of important studies, but his legacy is far from having been explored in all of its width and depth. He is the author of about 300 works, of which only less than 1/3 have been edited so far. The challenging task of a systematic exploration of this written legacy has been taken up in the last years by Professor Leila Demiri, who is doing her best to coordinate a group of research based at the Faculty of Islamic Theology in Tübingen. While being well known to scholars of Ibn Arabi and of the Akbarian tradition, in the last decades, Nâbulusî has also attracted the attention of historians of society and culture in the early Ottoman Arab world. He is in fact a key figure in order to shed more light on this long time neglected period, until recent times commonly defined as decline or inhitat, in contrast to the impending Nahda. And to shed light and to look at it with new perspectives. In my own research, I attempt somehow to bring together doctrinal and historical approaches, and this is what I will attempt to do now in speaking about the perfect man in Nâbulusî's work. If this notion does not merely refer to a doctrinal construct, but to a way of experiencing reality and of being in the world, we may say that Nâbulusî's work is significant precisely because it gives some clues to the practical, by which I mean the social, political, legal, but also aesthetical implications of the notion of insan kamil in real life. Speaking about the context and situatedness of his work, we may observe, to begin with, that Nâbulusî's style and approach as a commentator on the Fusus of Ibn Arabi is quite distinct from that of Turco-Persian authors like Kayseri and Kunawi. Nâbulusî's intended audience are not readers with a strong philosophical and theological background, as Gregory Van Dam noted about the audience of Kayseri. In the preface to his commentary on the Fusus, Nâbulusî says that his predecessors wrote for the initiated, who were already well advanced in the Sufi path, whereas his goal was to make the Fusus understandable for the uninitiated. Denis Gril, who wrote a close reading of this preface, observed that the Jawahir present itself at first sight as a near word-for-word explanation of Ibn Arabi's text, but his commentaries include many personal touches that allow the reader to glimpse his originality and the things he holds dearest. Among these personal touches that we can distinguish in Ibn Arabi's commentary on the Fusus, in Nâbulusî's commentary on the Fusus, is a marked preference for a figurative and concrete language that is consistent with his persuasion that the study of Ibn Arabi is relevant to the life of the city and to public morality and should be accessible to a wide public. In fact, Nâbulusî contributed to the diffusion of Ibn Arabi's vision of the world, not only through theoretical writings on the real being, the al-Wujud al-Haq, and commentaries on Akbarian texts, but also through more widely accessible media, poetry and short pamphlets. The latter were transmitted in large number of copies and also distributed by a wide network of correspondence that extended to all the Ottoman lands, from Sarajevo to the Hijaz, and in particular in the Bilad Rum. These pamphlets cover a range of topics that were hotly debated in his times, an inventory of which is found in the Khatib Chelebi or Haji Khalifa's work, The Balance of the Truth. Profane innovations as tobacco consumption and religious innovations as Sufi dance and whirling. A good number of Nâbulusî's interventions in these public debates are defenses of music, both in Sufi rituals and in more profane settings. Even though Ibn Arabi's position on music was quite nuanced, Ibn Arabi is a main reference for Nâbulusî also in his legal discussion of this issue, particularly from a methodological point of view. In his introduction to his most popular tract on listening to music, Nâbulusî quotes a passage from Ibn Arabi's Ruh al-Quds, his lives of the Andalusian saints, saying that the defense of the unknown and humble saints of Al-Andalus and the taking up of a bottom-up perspective was a venue of illumination for him. We may say that in his passion for poetry and engagement with a merciful interpretation of the law, Nâbulusî embodied the two aspects of Ibn Arabi's legacy that are more directly related to the public function of the saint, his role as transmitter to the Ummah at large. Nâbulusî's collection of poems encompass all of the genres of classical Arabic poetry and also strophic poetry. The Muwashshahat have an important place in his diwan, which may be considered as a high point of the development of this genre in the Mashriq. Nâbulusî's admiration for Shushtari could point to a deliberate continuity with Ibn Arabi also in this field, since we learned yesterday from the fascinating lecture of Pablo Benedito how the writing of Muwashshahat played an important role in Ibn Arabi's work. What is certain is that the verses of Nâbulusî have been an important channel for the diffusion of his ideas up to our days. A very popular example is taken from a Madih of the Prophet in Arabic. We can listen to the rhythm. قالت أقمار الدياج قل لأرباب الغرام كل من يعشق محمد ينبغي ألا ينام. Bright moons have spoken from the darkest nights. Tell those who burn with desire, for all who love Muhammad, sleep is forbidden. You can find on YouTube several recorded performances of this verse, which I had the chance to listen live 3 years ago in Marrakesh. Another still popular poem is a prediction. Is a prediction of the advent of a new messianic or mystical dawla attributed to Ibn Arabi. لونا دولة في آخر الدهر تظهر. We have a dawla which will appear at the end of times, which is sung by Burhanis in Egypt and Sudan, and was one of the favorite poems that were recited by another religious group based in Sudan, the Republican Brothers, Ikhwan al-Jumhuriyun, the followers of Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, who was executed in Khartoum in 1985 in the last period of Noumairi's rule. By the way, Nâbulusî is the #1 poet in the website of the Republican Brothers, alfikra.org, which has a section with the texts of Sufi poets and records of their performances in the gatherings of the group. Nâbulusî's lively presence in the religious culture of modern Sudan is an indication that when studying his influence, one should not only search historical handbooks reflecting the dominant historiographical approach, but also more informal and esoteric channels of transmission. If the neglect of Nâbulusî's work is due to the fact that he did not fit into the modernizing ideology of the Nahda and Islah, Renaissance and Reform, this does not mean that he ceased to be a source of inspiration to modern Muslims, perhaps even more in so-called peripheral regions as Sudan, less strongly affected by modern ideologies and institutions of learning. The diffusion of Nâbulusî's poetry up to our days is also a reminder of the fact that the esoteric and the popular are not necessarily contradictory notions. Benedito strongly reminded us of this, I think, in yesterday's lecture. The connection between esoteric knowledge and popular tradition is apparent in particular in the central role of the metaphysical notions of the Muhammadan light and the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya in the cult of the Prophet. This brings us back more directly to the subject of this summer school. In fact, in Nâbulusî, like in the Akbarian tradition more generally, the question of the dignity of man is inseparable from that of the metaphysical rank of the Prophet Muhammad. The competence of Nâbulusî in this domain received due recognition by the famous Ottoman scholar, late Ottoman scholar, Yusuf ibn Ismail al-Nabhani, who survived the Ottoman Empire by some 15 years, since he died in 1932. Nabhani wrote about Nâbulusî. He is one of the greatest Gnostic saints and the imam of practicing scholars. His way of bringing together the sciences of the apparent and the hidden is unmatched among all the authors I know of, who from his day to our own have surpassed themselves in knowledge and gnosis. From him, one can gain a great deal in all the sciences, especially those that concern religion, the unicity of God, divine gnosis, and the exaltation of the rank Ulu Qadr of the Lord of Messengers. May God bless him and bring him peace. In this passage by Nabhani, the exaltation of the rank of Muhammad is presented as a domain of the religious sciences in its own right. At the beginning of the 20th century, Nabhani published two monumental anthologies of prose texts and poems honoring the Prophet, mostly by Mamluk and Ottoman authors who wrote in Arabic but weren't necessarily Arabs. Within this collection of texts, Nabhani gathers the multiple genres of Nâbulusî's work related with the honoring the Prophet and the speculation on his metaphysical being. There are poems, Madaih, texts composed for the celebration of the Mawlid, commentaries on Sufi prayers. Among these, we may mention Nâbulusî's commentary on the Salat Faidiyya, which is attributed to Ibn Arabi, but as Stefan Hirtenstein told us, must probably be due to Abdullah Ghuznawi. But the most important source of Nabhani's quotation from Nâbulusî in his collection is the huge commentary of Nâbulusî on the poetry of the great Egyptian poet Ibn al-Farid. This is a very large work, surpassing the 2,000 pages, and it is perhaps the masterwork of Nâbulusî, this great commentary on Ibn al-Farid, which is a work of maturity, and is in some way also a self-portrait of Nâbulusî himself as a theologian and poet. Nâbulusî is instrumental also in the work of Nabhani, so at the very end of the Ottoman period, because Nabhani is highly polemical against the reformer admirers of Ibn Taymiyyah and the Wahhabi, and the arguments Nâbulusî used against his opponents were in fact equally relevant to the more serious challenges that Sufi piety faced in the modern period. This is why, for example, Nâbulusî's commentary on the Tariqa Muhammadiyya by Muhammad Birgivi has been reprinted in modern Turkey. Birgivi's book had become, in the 17th century, the combat book of the Kadizadeli movement. As shown in the studies of Derin Terzioglu and others, the Kadizadeli should not simply be considered as an anti-Sufi grassroots movement. Their puritanical and anti-Shia militancy should rather be put in the context of a process of religious confessionalization that was promoted by the Ottoman state in parallel with the rival Safavid Empire, starting from the late 16th century. At stake in this broader process were the very notions of Sunni orthodoxy and the inheritance of the Prophet legacy. In his commentary on Birgivi's Tariqa Muhammadiyya, Nâbulusî gives several important clues on the relevance of a mystical perspective to the definition of the Muhammadan path and thereby the Sunnah itself. I would say that the main teaching about the Sunnah Muhammadiyya in this commentary on Birgivi are related to the fact that the emphasis is on the Sunnah as a paradigm of the assumption of divine characters, the takhalluq bi akhlaq Allah, rather as a normative standard. The two important points Nâbulusî makes again and again in this work is that the Sunnah does not identify with a single and determined path isolated from all the others, but it is rather the path which is open and which leads to God, whoever goes through it. And another important point in his reflection on the Sunnah is that perfection is not confined to the past. This last point plays a prominent role also in Nâbulusî's treatises in defense of modern saints. I have edited two of these treatises dedicated respectively to the Indian Naqshbandi Shaykh Ahmad Sirhindi and to the Ottoman Khalwati Shaykh and poet Niyazi al-Misri. The first of these treatises, the one on Sirhindi, deals in particular with the renewal, tajdeed, of the presence of the Prophet. Appropriately, since Sirhindi's claim to be the renewer of the second millennium of the Hijra stirred much controversy in his times and also reached the Ottoman lands. In the preface to this work, Nâbulusî draws a distinction between the animal man and the complete human being, explaining that the latter is the one who has the perception of true being, the first determination of which is the Muhammadan light or Haqiqa Muhammadiyya. After Muhammad, the person who becomes the locus of manifestation of this original light is his true heir and substitute, and this is the one who partakes in his fardiyya, that is, in his being the human mirror of the divine attribute of oneness in plurality. The notion of renewal in the course of horizontal history is here coupled with the instantaneous perception of God's continuous self-manifestation. That is, Ibn Arabi's interpretation of the Quranic new creation, khalq jadid, that is never the same in two distinct moments and two different persons, and never completed in a single time. As Nâbulusî says in his treatise on Sirhindi, what is infinite does not come into existence all at once. The expansion of Muhammad's inheritance through his followers is a constant motive in Nâbulusî's work. In a Maulid, he says that the great river of Islamic literature is part of the Faid flow whose source is the Quran. Thus, he lists a long series of books beginning from the Futuhat of Ibn Arabi as the branches or stream that's coming from the Quran, as though the Prophet was the single author of them. And we may note that all the books Nâbulusî mentions here are Arabic, but with exception of Rumi's Mathnavi. So a living tradition is a seed that continues to grow. This applies to the legacy of Muhammad, whose perfections continue to grow. And the same applies to the legacy of the Shaykh al-Akbar. On this regard, there is a dream Nâbulusî records in his journal of dreams, where he said that he dreamt that he began to complete the Futuhat Makkiyah, as though they were lacking of an end. كأنها ناقصة من آخرها, as though their end had not yet been written, we can say. In some way, the belief in the saints as inheritors of the prophetic perfections is connected to the belief in human perfectibility. There is in fact a certain emphasis in Nâbulusî's work on the fact that human perfection is not confined to the individual experience of those who realize the direct knowledge of true being, but is also a matter of belief on the part of those who do not have this direct knowledge. Belief in this potentiality, as opposed to its denial, is actually a source of salvation for imperfect humans. Interpreting this point, one may suggest that the question of the perfect man is of concern not only to individual spiritual growth, but also to the collective life, insofar as it conditions the way in which the community's boundaries and future are imagined. In these remarks, if these remarks may apply in general to Nâbulusî's Islamic orientation, there is a more specific local context that is equally important in his use of Ibn Arabi's ideas. In this regard, there is a work that helps to understand the rootedness of Nâbulusî's work in Damascus and the Bilad al-Sham, not confined to modern day Syria, but including all of the Mashriq. This work, titled Al-Qawl al-Sadid fi Jawaz Khulf al-Wa'id wa-Radd ala Turk al-Anid, a sound discourse concerning the possibility that God will not carry out his threats and the refutation of the stubborn Turk. His work is a polemical treatise in which Nâbulusî brings together the defense of Ibn Arabi and the dignity of the Arabs and of Arabness. This work elaborates upon a passage from the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, where Ibn Arabi suggests that even though Islam superseded Judaism and Christianity, it confirmed their validity as religious laws in the case of protected peoples, dhimmis, because the legal institution of the dhimma includes them within the framework of the Sharia. For this reason, previous religions will lead their faithful followers to salvation in their hereafter, as well as they continue to regulate their worldly affairs. Nâbulusî defends this idea, arguing that God has no obligation to put his threats into practice. He supplements this theological reasoning with a linguistic argument. He contests the authority of his anonymous adversary, the Turk, the stubborn Turk of the title, to interpret the Quran, maintaining that he's incapable of understanding the spirit of the Arabic language, whereas Ibn Arabi and the Arab ulama whom he inspires do, on the contrary, understand it perfectly. The Arabic language has always been the inner language of revelation, exteriorized with the advent of Muhammad, the prophet of compassion. It is not sufficient to know the rules of its grammar in order to master it. One must have a natural disposition and the spontaneity, and this is why an illiterate Arab is considered more noble than an erudite non-Arab. In spite of their extensive study, most foreigners must make huge and painful efforts in order to speak Arabic. Even worse is to be a non-Arab at heart, Ajami al-Qalb, to lack the ear to speak in the accents of mercy, in the language of revelation. In other words, the approach of the Turk, or non-Arab at heart, to the Arabic language and the Quran is one of strict normativity, both grammatical and Islamic. People whose mother tongue is Arabic, even if they are illiterate and or not Muslims, are closer to the matrix from which the language sprang. It is possible to define the qawl as the defense of a specific instance of Ibn Arabi's merciful interpretation of the law against the rigorous interpretation prevailing at the time in the Ottoman government. A comparison with a text of the champion of the Kadijatayli movement at this time, the influential preacher Bani Effendi, who had a strong influence on the Ottoman government at the end of the 17th century, is enlightening in this regard. The anti-Turkish statements that Nâbulusî expresses in his work seem to echo and reverse the ethnic Turkish pride voiced by Bani Effendi in this Quranic commentary. Also here, we have a provocative superimposition of religious and ethnic categories. The Turks are exalted by Bani Effendi as the holders of military strength who embraced the divine command to wage war against the infidels, which was neglected by the Arabs. Since the conversion of the Turks of Central Asia in the 10th century, conquest, conversion of the infidels, and protection of Sunni orthodoxy are the religious mission of Turkish military powers, says Bani Effendi, as well as the basis of the legitimacy of the Turkish Ottoman dynasty and of its dominion over the Arab. Exalting the Turks, Bani Effendi champions an Islam allied to a powerful state, enforcing orthodoxy within the community and conquering infidel territories. To the contrary, Nâbulusî's praise of the Arabs conveys the message that the authentic and authoritative interpretation of Islam is independent from political power. Arabs continue to be the custodians of religious knowledge, even though they were disempowered. When things changed, says Nâbulusî, with the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Given Nâbulusî's emphasis on the merciful interpretation of religion, emphasizing its universal and loving dimensions, one could surmise that for him, powerlessness is not necessarily a negative quality, insofar as religion should not make recourse to coercion in order to impose itself. In the specific case of the dhimmis, the idea that they can enter paradise while keeping faithful to their own religions makes useless any attempt to convert them forcibly. In the rhetoric of the time, the notion of mercy has a significant political import among Arab as well as non-Arab critics of Ottoman siyasa. Mercy is a corrective to absolute rule, putting limits to the state's violence. This helps to explain why Ibn Arabi's emphasis on mercy was so fiercely debated at the time. As Derin Terzioglu's study on Niyazi al-Misri, which is the other author's contemporary author, Nâbulusî defense in his treatises, in Niyazi's polemics against the Ottoman government also stresses this quality of mercy based on Akbarian notions. So we may say that Nâbulusî is not only addressing the Ummah, but a real city of which non-Muslims are an integral part. The importance of Nâbulusî's local situatedness is also evident from his travelogues that may be regarded as the celebration of a religious landscape nourished by the presence of saints and prophets. his journey to Jerusalem gives a vivid idea of what is in his high Holy Land. In particular, in his description of Al-Khalil or Hebron, I mean, it is my own reading, but this passage really gives the impression that beyond the succession of competing appropriations of sacred sites in the course of history, the presence of the divine mercy in the land is perceptible in its nature, the generous streams of water that traverse it, as well as in the gratuitous distribution of bread to all those who need it at the famous oven of Al-Khalil. The sanctity of the sites, as it were, is shared by the local people belonging to different religions, just like the natural riches of the land. To sum up, we may say that a key role of Nâbulusî has been that of domesticating Ibn Arabi's legacy in Damascus, which does not mean to provincialize it, but to root it in the life of the city. This assessment of Nâbulusî's impact is visible also beyond my own interpretation, in the main hagiographical source on him. This is a 600 pages biography written a few decades after his death by his grandson Kamal ad-Din al-Ghazi, who died in 1799 and was published by Brill in the edition of Samuela Pagani. This book, this biography, has been written in the same period when has been built the minaret of Nâbulusî's mosque in the Salihiyya quarter of Damascus, currently known as Muhyiddin, because its landmark is Ibn Arabi's tomb. This minaret in some way achieved the inscription of Nâbulusî's presence in Damascus' urban landscape. It was built with the financial support of the Azm governor, that is, by a representative of the famous dynasty of Arab governors that marked the city's economical and architectural renaissance in the late 18th century. The appropriation and naturalization of Ibn Arabi in Damascus through Nâbulusî's mediation is connected by his biographer Ghazi to the fortune of the city and implicitly to the political autonomy it obtained under the Azm governors. Ghazi quotes the verses attributed to Ibn Arabi about the Dawlatuna, our Dawla, which come at the end of days, saying that it undoubtedly alludes to the fact that the Nâbulusî, as the heir to the seal of the saints, will be born in Syria. And so this interpretation of Ghazi is a Syrian-centered interpretation, which in some way is an alternative to the Ottoman-centered interpretation of the eschatological predictions attributed to Ibn Arabi since the beginning of the Ottoman rule. Well, with this, I achieved the first part of my presentation, which aimed at framing Nâbulusî's work and approach to the Insan Kamil. And as for the textual example I would like to present to you, it is, as I mentioned before, his commentary on the chapter on Jonas of the Fusus. And so at this point, I would begin with the sharing the screen with you. Yes, but not immediately, in fact. So as we have seen, the non-fulfillment of the divine threat of punishment was a major topic of Nâbulusî's work against the stubborn Turk, and in defense of the Dhimmis, Arabness, and Ibn Arabi at the same time. Now, this theological question of the non-fulfillment of the threat is also at the center of the figure of Jonah in the Bible and subsequently in the Islamic tradition. So I will begin to say something about this theological background. The question of the non-fulfillment of the divine threat is a theological political problem with complex juridical and hermeneutical implications. It has its biblical point of departure in Moses' intercession for his people, unbinding God from his oath of destruction in Exodus 32:14. It is after the golden calf story. This passage is echoed in the book of Jonah, the prophet of doom, outraged by the salvation of the people of Nineveh. The salvation of Nineveh is a case of suspension of punishment whose importance is witnessed by its liturgical commemoration in the Jewish Day of Atonement and in the Syrian Christian rogation of the Ninevites. Also in Muslim tradition, the figure of Jonah, among other prophets, is related to the fast of Ashura. The salvation of the people of Nineveh plays an important role also in the discussion on eternal hell in St. Augustine, City of God, where St. Augustine endeavors to demonstrate against his perversely compassionate adversaries that the salvation of the Ninevites cannot be adduced as an example of non-fulfillment of the divine threat. The problem of the salvation of the people of Nineveh is addressed, albeit indirectly, also in Ibn Arabi's chapter on Jonah, which represents a perfect reversal of the theological political perspective exemplified by Augustine in the City of God. So I will begin to quote the opening passage of the chapter. Yeah. Well, know that this human creation in all its spiritual, physical, and physical perfection was created by God in his own image, and that none but he has charge of its dissolution, whether by his hand, which is always the case, or by his command. Whoever takes it on himself without God's command wrongs his own soul, transgresses the bounds of God, and seeks the destruction of him whose proper functioning God has ordered. Indeed, solicitude in caring for God's servants is better than killing them from an excessive zeal for God. David desired to build the holy house and did so several times. However, every time he finished it, it fell down in ruins. When he complained of that to God, God revealed to him, "My house shall not be raised in hand of one who has spilled blood." David then said, "O Lord, was it not done in your cause?" God said to him, "Indeed, but are they not my servants?" Then that David said, "O Lord, let it then be built by one who is of me." God then revealed to him that his son Solomon would build it. This dialogue between David and God is very close to that between God and Jonah in the Bible and in the Muslim stories of the prophets, where God puts into question Jonah's right to wrath, remembering him the duty of protection that the Creator has towards every living being. Here, David is not blamed for having exceeded the bounds of the prescribed legal punishments. In fact, and this is a sin against which Islamic religious literature frequently warns political authorities. In fact, God does not object to David's claim of having done so in his cause. The paradoxical meaning of this story is well captured by Ibn al-Jawzi's indignant remark. Says Ibn al-Jawzi, "It is awful to say that he was allowed or ordered to kill a people and that he was therefore excluded from God's satisfaction for him. The dialogue with David challenges this distinction between friend and foe. All men, even the political religious enemies of the people of God, are God's creators and bearers of his image, in potentiality, if not in actuality. In fact, as Ibn Arabi says in this same chapter, while a man still has life, he has the opportunity to achieve that perfection for which he was created, so that whoever tries to destroy him is seeking to prevent his achieving that for which he was made. It also challenges the correspondence between divine and earthly sovereignty. The killing state, however legitimate, cannot be consecrated by the construction of the temple. The spiritual source of this respect for human life is the ability to recognize God's image in one's companion. Being able to see the image in every man is a special spiritual grace. Many saints did in fact see religious enemies in the form of pigs and apes. This special grace is well expressed by John of Dalyatha, a Syrian mystic of the 8th century, living in Abbasid, Iraq, who said, as a result of the vision of these things, a love of humanity descends upon the soul and a constant supplication for its conversion. When the intellect looks within itself, it sees all mankind in the form of the image of God in which it was created. In the vision produced by this state, there is neither righteous person nor sinner, neither slave nor free, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, neither male nor female, but Christ appears wholly in everyone. Apparently, both for Ibn Arabi and John of Dalyatha, the conscience of the commonality of the divine image in man wipes out the categories and distinctions which produce difference and justify hatred and violence. What to make then of the punitive dimensions of the law? In Jonah's chapter, the Sharia itself provides the remedy to its own violence. Ibn Arabi mentions the regulation of jihad and qisas, retaliation, where violence is permitted, but peace treaties and pardon are recommended. Most importantly, the revelation is explicit in declaring retribution an evil. The Quranic verse 42:40, God says, the recompense of one evil is an evil like it, وَجَزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ مِثْلُهَا, refers to retaliation as an evil action, even though it is legal. Thus, what is legal does not necessarily conform with the ultimate intention of the law, which is further revealed by the noble virtues, the makarim al-akhlaq, embodied in the prophet model, and remembered in the chapter on Jonah of the Fusus by the hadith exhorting to recite the dhikr rather than waging war, and by another hadith discouraging from exacting retaliation. The fulfillment of the law is represented by pardon rather than by the enforcement of punishment. This understanding is reserved to the ones who perceive the essence of things and who have discovered the secret of God's laws, says Ibn Arabi. And one may suggest that these are the saints who have the foretaste of the interpretation of the law that Jesus will make public at the time of his descent, as Ibn Arabi mentions in the chapter on David, which precedes immediately the one on Jonah. In the same time, in the same way as the principle of pardon prevails in the Sharia, God will not mete out eternal punishment in hell. This is the point developed in the second part of the chapter on Jonah. God does not will the annihilation of man, neither in this world nor in the next. Death is only passage towards another form of life, and the pains of hell will not last eternally, even though some will eternally stay there. Jonah is never mentioned in this chapter of Ibn Arabi, but his presence is felt nonetheless. On one hand, as we have seen, Jonah resembles David as a zealous executioner of God's wrath. Even more important are the implicit references in the text to the Quranic surah of Jonah, where the story of this prophet is not mentioned, but reference is made to the salvation of his people at Quran 10:98. Ibn Arabi refers to this verse in many passages of the Futuhat. Contrary to St. Augustine and many Muslim commentators, Ibn Arabi reads this episode as a case of non-fulfillment of the divine threat and as an announcement of universal salvation. The people of Jonah, according to Ibn Arabi, are an exception to the stories of punishment related in the same surah because they were saved not only in the other world, but also in this world. Also, the chapter on Jonah in the Fusus is concerned with the salvation of the human constitution in both worlds. Moreover, in the Surah of Jonah, eschatological retribution is defined with almost the same words as in the verse on retaliation, 42:40 mentioned before about the Sayyah. It says, Quran 10:27, and for those who have earned evil deeds, the recompense of an evil deed shall be the like of it. This parallelism suggests that the critique of legitimate violence contained, albeit implicitly, in Revelation equally applies to earthly law and to eschatology. Now, the personal touches and originality and attention to concrete detail, which are apparent in Nâbulusî's commentary on the Fusus, are visible also in his commentary on Jonah, where we find that Nâbulusî distinguishes himself from other commentators of the Fusus, at least the ones I consulted and compared, because of his concern with the political implications of the text. And now I'll show you a passage of the commentary from the beginning. Where Nâbulusî says, Ibn Arabi remembers Jonah after the chapter on David, because we have here a refinement of and a completion to the chapter and the declaration of the respect due to the human species in absolute terms, in the measure of the possible, in consideration of the general succession established or khilafa established for every legally capable person in the rights he possesses, even though he abuses of them, acts unjustly, and transgresses the fixed limits. For he will respond of this after his death, which will divest him from his capacity. Then there is a series of quotations from Quranic verses where the term, the root khalafa is used not in the meaning of representative of God, but of successor, and is applied to humanity in general. These and similar verses indicate that all the sons of Adam are successors, khulafa, upon the earth. However, this is not the khilafa which is perfect outwardly, as in the case of kings, or at the same time outwardly and inwardly, as in the case of prophets and of their heirs from among the saints. All the other commentaries on the Fusus that I have examined agree upon the fact that the chapter of Jonah is a completion to the preceding chapter on David. But Nâbulusî's explanation, based on the distinction between general and particular khilafa, is peculiar to him. This distinction is evoked by Ibn Arabi in the chapter on David, where he compares David's khilafa to that of Adam. David is the Khalifa of God and his representative invested with the power of judgment, whereas Adam's regency might have been based on the fact that he had succeeded whoever was there before. End of quote from the chapter of David. This general meaning of the term Khalifa, understood simply as successor and dissociated from the concept of sovereignty, was propounded by some early exegetes and later discarded by the majority of Quranic commentators. Nâbulusî's retrieval of this meaning makes explicit the distinctive perspective of the chapter of Jonah, which poses the problem of religio-political authority from the bottom up, whereas in the chapter on David, it was posed from the standpoint of the representative or divine authority. The bottom-up perspective fits well with Nâbulusî's unique emphasis on rights of man and their universality. There is another original point of Nâbulusî's commentary, and it is that he adds to the legal punishments whose enforcement should be avoided, fixed penalties, hudud, and discretionary punishments, ta'azir, involving death, whereas Ibn Arabi had mentioned only retaliation. He seems particularly concerned with a fixed penalty for unlawful intercourse, had al-zina. Here, Nâbulusî expands on the passage by Ibn Arabi, where he says, compassion for God's servants has more right to be observed than zeal for God, saying, compassion on the part of man for God's servants, regardless whether they are believers or unbelievers, and even in the case of a fixed penalty or of retaliation or similar things, has more right and is more worthy to be observed than zeal of God in killing and spilling blood. As for God's words, the woman or man found guilty of unlawful intercourse, lash each one of them with 100 lashes, and do not be taken by pity for them in the religion of God. It does apply only to those kinds of fixed penalties, discretionary punishments, and so on, which do not entail killing and spilling blood. Apparently, this implies that the Quranic warning not to feel pity for the offenders applies to flogging, namely the had for fornication established in the Quran, but not to stoning, the penalty established on the basis of hadith. There are several passages in Nâbulusî's work scattered here and there, which underline the fact that assisting to a public capital punishment is a sin. For example, he quotes from the work of the Egyptian Sufi scholar al-Munawi, who lived a century before him, a passage of his commentary on the collection of hadith by Suyuti, saying, Tabarani and Bayhaqi reported from Prophet that none of you stand by a place where a man is unjustly killed, for the onlookers will be cursed if they do not defend him. And Munawi comments, the word unjustly here excludes the case of those who are killed by the sword of the divine law or at last for unlawful intercourse because of God's word, and let a group of believers witness the punishment. So also in this commentary of Munawi, the only penalty mentioned in relationship to that Quranic verse forbidding pity is lashing. This is quite implicit but significant. Now, these scattered references to the penalty for unlawful intercourse in Nâbulusî's work suggest that the topic had immediate relevance when Nâbulusî was writing these works. In fact, the older of these the commentary on the Tariqa Muhammadiyya, was completed in 1682, only 2 years after the spectacular case of public stoning which had taken place in Istanbul, when a woman was stoned to death in the Hippodrome for having an affair with a Jew. Many contemporary observers reacted negatively to the enforcement of the had, deeming that the judge disregarded the rules of evidence established by the Sharia. This, which is the only recorded instance of public stoning in the Ottoman capital, was in many respects an exemplary case. The execution, which had been strongly encouraged by the already mentioned Vani Effendi, well fitted his religious policy, for it did away at the same time with sexual disorder and interfaith relationships. This high point of the alliance between the state and the Qadizadelis was also a disquieting case of Ottoman Siyasa Shar'iyya, where the Sultan made executory a legally doubtful sentence. Nâbulusî is not exceptional for his critical stance towards Ottoman Siyasa Shar'iyya, but he is original in his way to articulate it, bringing together classical fiqh aversion from the enforcement of hudud and Ibn Arabi's theological critique of legitimate violence, thus getting close, Nâbulusî himself, to a theorization of the absolute interdiction of capital punishment. So we have a very concrete, as I said at the beginning, a very down to the earth, very situated approach to the work of Ibn Arabi, Nâbulusî, and also to the vision of the world related to the notion of the perfect man. And this can be grasped paying much attention to small details which could escape easily our attention if we don't take into account the background and the real situation in which they are situated, even though obviously this is also an indication of that the modern interpreter is really it's really very, very far from the possibility of understanding the real references of the text he studies. But a recurring motif, which is related not only to single events or episodes, a recurring motif which is common to the chapter on Jonah, and is I mean, that is mentioned at the very beginning of the chapter on Jonah, where it is said that human creation in all spiritual, physical, and physical perfection, bikamaliha ruhan wa jisman wa nafsan. So the fact that the body is an integral part of the human wholeness, this point is a recurrent theme in Nâbulusî's work, which is also closely related to his description of the metaphysical rank of the prophet. In his commentary on the last chapter of the Fusus, the chapter on Muhammad, Nâbulusî has another gloss to the text, which I have the impression is quite original. And this is this explanation of Ibn Arabi's description of Muhammad as Muthallath al-Nash, tribal in his constitution. Ibn Arabi, Nâbulusî says, Ibn Arabi says that Muhammad is tribal, Muthallath al-Nash, because his constitution is based on 3 principles. And he is the noble temple whose outward is corporeal and whose interior is spiritual, and whose barzakh is psychic, while each of these three parts, which are in him, is this identical with the other from one side and different from it from the other side. The positive role of the body and the senses is also a recurring motif of Nâbulusî's commentary on Ibn al-Farid. This work, as I mentioned before, is the main source of the quotations from Nâbulusî in Yusuf Nabhani's collection of texts on the metaphysical rank of Muhammad. And the fact that is all the more remarkable because in this text, the exaltation of Muhammad is inseparable from that of his hair and of his literary achievement. So there is a remarkable description of spiritual transformation as it relates to poetic expression in this commentary on Ibn al-Farid. Where Nâbulusî explains how it is that the poet passes from his psychic self, his condition as nafsani, to his Rabbani self, his lordly self. And getting to the lordly self and stripping oneself from the nafsani self means that at that point the Hakika Muhammadiyya itself is the tongue speaking through the poet, and and the poetic voice is that at that point the expression of the only first person, which is the divine person. In one remarkable passage, Nâbulusî describes the spiritual and poetic itinerary of Ibn al-Farid as a circular path. In the first phase, when the poet, through his insight, discovers that the Hakika Muhammadiyya is the source of light, his tongue is untied, and he composes figurative poetry according to his mastery of the poetic arts and literary sciences, even if his discourse should be called a divine science rather than poetry. Then, when he passes into the state of annihilation, his discourse separates itself from him, and he openly proclaims the union with God, believing himself to have passed the stage of the Hakika Muhammadiyya. But once he becomes settled in this station, he discovers that it does, in fact, belong to the Hakika Muhammadiyya, to the facet of it that is turned towards absolute unity, called Hakika Ahmadiyya by Nâbulusî. At this point, and henceforth conscious that love for Muhammad and love for the true being are one and the same, speech returns to the poet, and he begins once again to compose erotic poetry and celebrate the beauty of the apprendable word as he had at the beginning, except that now the person speaking is the only true speaker. This means that when the poet expresses his passion for the beautiful faces of boys or girls, even if this passion resembles that of a lover put to the text by the love of images, the source and goal of his words is always the Hakika Muhammadiyya. So essentially, understanding the nature of the Hakika Muhammadiyya means grasping the continuity or coexistence of subtlety and density, of the spirit and the body. This means that reality can be perceived by the five senses as it can be perceived by spiritual intuition. In fact, Muhammad, as Nâbulusî stresses, is the principle within which the spirit and the light, the two ways of exteriorizing the invisible, join together. Nâbulusî sometimes describes Muhammadan light as the primal matter, Madda Hagiology, from which God, as demiurge, fashioned the world. The clay from which Adam's body was made also comes from the flow of this luminous material. Importantly, the body's luminous origin means that the original legal assessment of all things is indifference, ibaha, while any interdiction is secondary or accidental. This principle is the basis for the defense of listening to music and of the gaze, and also fits in with the attitude of malama, avoiding distinguishing oneself from the common believers and refraining from avoiding, for fear of scandal, for example, the company of people who are lost and corrupt, in Nâbulusî's own definition in his commentary on Ibn al-Farid. The positive nature of the body also means that the entire human being, spirit, soul, and body, is made in God's image and therefore sacred, even if the individual is not a saint. Of course, this applies to Muhammad, the archetype, as we have seen in his definition of Muthallaf and Nash, but in fact applies to every human being, which implies that one must adopt every recourse available in law in order to avoid bloodshed. As we have seen, Ibn Arabi affirms this in the chapter on Jonah in the book of Fusus, and in his commentary on this passage, Nâbulusî underlines the fact that the Khilafah of God generally belongs to all human beings, and not only to those who exert inner spiritual authority or external worldly powers. So there is a strong intertextuality, in fact, among the different works of Nâbulusî, and his thoughts on the human perfection form a kind of continuous of underlying stream, underlying basic notion which traverses all of his work, and so it is up to us in some way to join together these scattered indications and to imagine everyone according to his own disposition how they are related to each other. That's the end of my presentation.